So this week we're going to be talking about the formal research paper. This is the bread and butter of our academic genre systems, but it varies from discipline to discipline. So a lot of this advice is going to be, well, look at the examples in your own discipline for details. But there are a few things we can kind of generalize about. Um, so, professionally published research papers, like you're reading in the academic journals and so on, they tend to be about 20 to 25 pages long in the standard formats, the double spaced 12-point font, and so on. Yours is going to be more like what's called a conference paper, which generally follows most of the same conventions as the formal research paper, but it's typically 8 to 12 pages long rather than the 20 to 25 pages long, because 8 to 12 pages can typically be read aloud in a 15-minute time spot at a conference, which is typical. Um, so that's a more realistic length for less formal situations and for sharing quickly. Um, so the research paper needs to include how the research was done, why it needs to have been done, and what was found out, and how that can be applied. And so one way we can do that is with a very typical template that we call IMRaD, IMRAD structure. And you read about this in the textbook, or we'll read about it depending on what order you're doing this in. And the IMRaD stands for Introduction, Method, Results, and Discussion. That's why the A is lowercase, because it's the and. It also lets us pronounce it. This is similar in some ways to the 5-paragraph essay structure that you're probably already familiar with, and I previously told you to kind of lay aside for formal academic writing most of the time. And it's similar in that you have a broad introduction that contextualizes what you're talking about, and then in your body you get into a lot of detail about your evidence and your argument, and then in your conclusion you expand that back out into the real world, into the rest of the context. So the other way it does this is another way to think about like that 5-paragraph essay structure and also IMRAD is to say what you're going to say what you're saying, and then say what you did say. So let's go over the parts of IMRAD. So in the introduction, you say why the research needs to be done. To do that, you need to give an overview of what research has already touched on the topic and why the topic is important, as well as describing what hasn't been said. So we call that the gap. So you've got this conversation that's going on, and people are talking about this, and people are talking about this, but there's something in between, and that in between is the gap, and your goal is to fill that gap. So you need to identify that gap in order to fill that, and in order to justify to your reader that you are filling that gap. So in a conventional introduction, you might say, you want to give a broad introduction to the topic, but do not start at the dawn of time. Whatever you do, ever since people have been writing about writing. No. You wanna start very close to your topic. So if you're writing about, to use my NaNoWriMo study example again, I would say something like, National Novel Writing Month is an event that writers have been participating in since 2001. However, it hasn't been sufficiently studied even in the 17 years it's been going on. And so I've already established, okay, this is why we need to study it. It's been going on for a while, but we don't know what's going on. So then what you can do is called a literature review. And a literature review is sort of a summary of the discussion. It's a gigantic explanatory synthesis. And in the literature review, you cover what's already been said. And this is a really conventional, template-worthy academic move that you can make. And it sounds super professional because people do it and people expect it. So your typical literature review template goes something like, scholars have said, but what they're not saying is, my study will address what they're not saying in this way. And you can even use those exact words, although you'll of course need to fill in quite a lot of blanks. So it's a big summary of your secondary sources. This is a really good place to show off your research and show that you're well read in the field. The next part, after you've done your introduction that contains a literature review, is the method. In this part, you explain how your original research, that is your primary sources, was carried out, and you do so in sufficient detail that other researchers can A, analyze your results appropriately and critically, and B, replicate your study if necessary or possible. Some studies obviously can't be replicated, but if possible, they need to know how that would be done. So replicability is really important, especially in the more empirical fields in your hard sciences where you use laboratory conditions and so on. You really need to know down to what equipment is being used in order to replicate that study. However, in more humanistic fields, sometimes we can't replicate that study because we observed a one-time event. Like if I were going to write a paper on Twitch Plays Pokemon, which I swear one of these days I will, that was a one-time event, and so there's no way I can replicate that study. But I can definitely tell people how I conducted that study so they can know about the validity of my study. And they can use their critical reading techniques to understand my study. So for instance, in this section, if you did interviews, tell your reader who you interviewed and what your criteria was for choosing who to interview. If you did a survey, how did you recruit your survey participants? How many survey participants did you get? What are their broad demographics like? What percentage of surveys that you sent out did you get returned? Although with digital surveys that might not be relevant. But basically that kind of metadata that we need to know about how you went about the thing. If you did an observation, say what you observed, when you observed it, how you selected that observation event, what your questions were when you're observing it. You can include things like survey questions and interview questions and stuff in an appendix if you don't want to reproduce them entirely in this section, but this is the section where you would reference that and say see Appendix A for further detail. So just keep in mind that we need all the details about what was done, how it was done, and when it was done here. That's not to say that you need to tell me you looked things up in a database. That's primarily secondary research anyway, unless you were specifically analyzing how the database returns material, but that's a different situation. That's such an assumed method of research that you don't need to say that. So here you need to say what would be necessary to replicate the research that would not necessarily be assumed. Then you go into your results. In this section, explain what the results were of the method that you described in the previous section. So you kind of have to restrain yourself in the previous section from telling the results because that's what comes next. So in this section, for instance, if you did an interview, tell us what the patterns were in those interviews. If you did a survey, what were the exact results of those surveys? And I mean down to the numbers where N equals 78, and of those 78, 23 said such and such, you know, whatever it was. If you did an observation, this is where you get to talk about what your key observations were of that session. And then from there, and you can see how this moves kind of organically, in the discussion, you tell us what it all means. How do we interpret this information? This often overlaps with a conclusion, but it does a little more than a conclusion, and so it holds its own space. So in the discussion, you tie back to the literature review that you did in your introduction. And so this is your point where you can tell us that your results were similar to or different than other similar studies. This is the point where you can tell us whether or not your results were surprising in any way. This is the place where you can tell us anything about how we should interpret this result. How do we apply the results of your study? And then you typically have a conclusion which flows very smoothly out of that, because in a conclusion, you often ask your reader to follow up in some way. Conclusions often end with either a call for further research of, well, we don't fully understand this phenomenon, so here's where my research lacks information and that you can further expand on. Or with a call to action. So, for instance, if I did that NaNoWriMo study and my results showed that NaNoWriMo was not effective for students who don't already identify as authors, which my preliminary results are starting to suggest, then my recommendation might be not to use NaNoWriMo in a general classroom, but only in a writing specific classroom where students have chosen to take the course. So that's a specific recommendation. That's a call to action. Um, or I might have inclusive data and I might say, you know what, my method was flawed for these reasons, and therefore this study needs to be conducted in a later year in these ways, and make those recommendations and a call for more research. So as you look over your data and as you write your paper, look for examples of the IMRaD structure in published papers. Sometimes it's really obvious. They'll actually have it labeled introduction, method, results, discussion. Sometimes it's not obvious and you just kind of have to follow their signposting as they write their transitions and make moves between the different modes, and you can actually use like a highlighter or something and mark where that happens. So pay attention to how other people are writing these things and try to imitate it and integrate it into your own writing, because when I grade it, I will be looking for IMRAD structure or something similar to it in a genre specific and appropriate way.